All right, let's just jump right in. We're anchoring our journey today on a singular, truly fascinating concept, Europe's constant, 50,000-year tug-of-war between grand unification and fragmented division. It's an epic history of incredible technological leaps, devastating conflicts, and constantly shifting borders. So, in this explainer, we're going to explore exactly how this continent was shaped, completely shattered, and rebuilt, time and time again.
Before we get too deep into the weeds, here's our roadmap. We'll be tracking 6 distinct eras. First, the dawn of European civilization. Second, the age of classical empires. Third, the medieval era. From there, we move to rebirth, religion, and discovery. Then, the age of revolutions, and finally, the modern European crucible.
Let's kick things off with Part 1, Dawn of European Civilization, from Paleolithic hunters to Greek philosophy.
We're going to accelerate all the way from 50,000 BC, when hunter-gatherers were just leaving cave paintings, right up to the 5th century BC. Notice that huge fundamental shift around 7,000 BC. That's when farming was introduced from the Middle East, replacing nomadic camps with permanent settlements. This eventually birthed the Bronze Age civilizations, like the seafaring Minoans on the island of Crete, and ultimately paved the way for the bustling, democratic streets of Athens.
Now, this early era perfectly highlights a major vulnerability in Europe: division. On one hand, you have Athens, literally pioneering democracy and laying the foundation for Western civilization with thinkers like Socrates. But all of that brilliance was severely weakened by a protracted rivalry with the highly militaristic state of Sparta. Sparta ended up winning the Peloponnesian War, but that constant infighting left Greece as a whole incredibly vulnerable to outside conquerors. It's a recurring theme we're going to see a lot throughout history.
Moving right along to Part 2, the age of classical empires, the rise and fall of Rome. Out of those weakened Greek states, a totally new superpower emerged, tipping the scales back toward unity. Rome evolved from just a small city ruled by kings back in 753 BC to a massive republic governed by a senate, and finally into this absolutely unparalleled imperial juggernaut. By the 2nd century AD, Rome had absorbed incredibly diverse tribes across the continent, everyone from the Celts in Britain to the Gauls in France. But, of course, this massive entity would eventually collapse in the West by 476 AD.
Just think about the sheer scale of this achievement for a second: 5.9 million. At its peak, the Roman Empire covered an astonishing 5.9 million square kilometers. They brought a unified Pax Romana, a golden age of relative peace and stability. They overlaid the entire continent with standardized laws, a common administrative language in Latin, and sprawling road networks, temporarily uniting a wildly vast patchwork of different cultures.
But, as you might guess, when that pendulum swung back to division, it swung hard. Europe fractured violently into 2 entirely different realities. The West was completely overrun by Germanic tribes, fragmenting into insular tribal kingdoms, and entering what we often call the Dark Ages. Meanwhile, the eastern half survived as the Byzantine Empire. They were a wealthy, urbanized state that held on to classical Greek and Roman learning, all guided by the Eastern Orthodox faith.
Which brings us to Part 3, the medieval era, kings, faith, and catastrophe.
During this time, everyday medieval life was totally locked into a strict feudal system. Society was basically divided into 3 rigid camps: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The clergy handled spiritual welfare, while kings and nobles handed out land in exchange for military service. This created a crystal-clear line separating a tiny, powerful elite from the peasants. Up to 90% of Europe's population was tied to the land, working tirelessly just to get basic protection from their lords. For the vast majority of people, it was an era of immense stagnation. And then, the 14th century brought absolute ruin. 1/3. That is the staggering portion of Europe's entire population wiped out by the Black Death between 1347 and 1352. Entire villages just completely vanished. Yet, ironically, this cataclysm inadvertently shifted the balance of power. With such a massive labor shortage, the surviving peasants suddenly had real leverage to demand better wages, triggering uprisings that slowly began to upend that rigid feudal order.
Okay, Part 4. Rebirth, Religion, and Discovery, the Renaissance and the Shattering of Christendom.
Out of all that plague and war, an incredible catalyst emerged. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, scholars fled to Italy, bringing ancient texts with them. This sparked the Renaissance, a stunning revival of classical art, perspective, and anatomy. Then you add Gutenberg's printing press to the mix, which completely mass-produced these new ideas. Simultaneously, Europe enters the Age of Discovery. This meant expanding globally and generating unbelievable wealth.
but it became deeply, darkly entangled with the horrific reality of the transatlantic slave trade, where millions of Africans were captured and forced into labor to feed Europe's growing economic engines. These connected events completely rewired the global economy in ways we still feel today.
But here's the catch. That rising literacy back home meant people started questioning the medieval church. In 1517, Martin Luther's 95 Theses spread like wildfire, basically acting like a hammer to glass. The spiritual unity that had defined the Middle Ages completely shattered into a Protestant North, Catholic South, and Orthodox East. This unleashed a whole century of sectarian warfare, deeply intertwining faith and state power, and culminating in devastating conflicts like the 30 Years' War, which killed millions across German lands.
That leads us into Part 5, the Age of Revolutions, Science, Industry, and Upheaval.
While those religious wars were raging, a totally different kind of revolution was happening in the minds of scientists. Grounded in observation and reason, the scientific revolution birthed the 18th century Enlightenment, where thinkers started openly questioning absolute monarchy. Well, those ideals eventually boiled over into the streets. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, leading to the execution of the French king and paving the way for Napoleon to seize power. And even though Napoleon's chaotic continental empire came to an end at Waterloo in 1815, those core ideas of freedom and self-determination were permanently planted in the European psyche.
Simultaneously, the Industrial Revolution was completely flipping daily life upside down. Steam power, railways, it all triggered an absolute explosion in manufacturing. Millions of people packed up and moved into overcrowded, severely polluted cities. And what's absolutely crucial here is the new social divide. You had a massively wealthy bourgeois class of factory owners towering over an impoverished, struggling working class. By the 1840s, this stark inequality prompted thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to argue that capitalism was inherently exploitative, which birthed the socialist movements that would go on to define modern politics.
And so the pendulum swung fiercely back toward aggressive, divided nation-states. Fueled by this newfound industrial might and intense nationalism, unified nations like Germany and Italy joined traditional powers like Britain and France in a frantic scramble for imperial dominance, literally drawing arbitrary borders all across Africa. Back home, this intense rivalry pushed heavily armed empires into massive, highly volatile blocs, namely the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. The continent had effectively turned into a powder keg, just waiting for a match.
This sets the stage for Part 6, the modern European crucible, World Wars and the Cold Divide.
In 1914, literally a single assassination in Sarajevo ignited those fragile alliances we just talked about, plunging the entire continent into the unprecedented industrial slaughter of World War I. The sheer strain of that war toppled ancient regimes, but the peace didn't last long. Barely 2 decades later, the trauma of the Great Depression fueled the rapid rise of extremist regimes, pulling Europe straight into World War II. During this incredibly dark period, Nazi Germany orchestrated the Holocaust, systematically murdering over 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others. It was an unfathomable destruction that left Europe physically and emotionally shattered.
Emerging from the ashes of the Second World War, Europe was physically and ideologically cleaved right in two during the Cold War. The West was largely rebuilt with American aid, forming democratic alliances like NATO and early economic unions. But the East? The East was locked tightly behind the Iron Curtain, with communist regimes installed and rigidly controlled by the Soviet Union. The continent was perfectly, tensely divided by two global superpowers.
Then, in 1989, the pendulum swung back toward unity again with the peaceful collapse of those communist regimes and the dramatic fall of the Berlin Wall. The following decade saw an incredible eastward expansion of both the EU and NATO. But the story obviously doesn't end with perfect harmony. Recent events like Brexit in 2016 showcase deep political disillusionment, and the tragic, full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 serves as a really stark reminder to all of us that borders, identity, and peace remain fiercely contested on this continent to this very day.
So, looking back at 50,000 years of empires rising and falling, from the Pax Romana to the Iron Curtain to the modern European Union, we have to ask ourselves, is this constant swing between grand unification and violent fracture simply the inescapable nature of Europe, or can lasting unity actually finally be achieved? I hope this explainer gave you a powerful framework for understanding this incredibly complex history. Thanks so much for learning with us today, and keep asking those big questions.